Today's daf is daf Yutes, and we're going to start here on the top of Yutes Amud Aleph, and we're talking about the shita of Rabbi Shimon with regard to pouring the oil onto the flour. And Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that a Kohen has to do the pouring of the oil, and a Zar is not allowed to do the pouring of the oil because the pasuk says Bnei Aaron, HaKohanim. And Rabbi Shimon says Mikra Nidrash Lefonov Uliachorov. In other words, when you have a pasuk, you can read a word as referring not just to what comes afterwards, but also as to what comes before it. So let's read the pasuk again. And the pasuk says, Vayitzak V'yatzak Oleha Shemen. No mention of Bnei Aaron so far. V'nasan Oleha Levona. And then Vehevia El Bnei Aaron HaKohanim V'komatz. So that the point in which the Bnei Aaron are mentioned in the pasuk is Kmitza. So if you darshan a pasuk Lefanov, then it would mean that the requirement of Bnei Aaron only applies from Kmitza and onward, but not to the Yitzika that came before it. But Rabbi Shimon, which the Gemara is going to reject this eventually, but right now the Gemara holds that according to Rabbi Shimon, it's Nidrash even Lachorov, and you see the requirement of Bnei Aaron HaKohanim as referring even to that which came before at the beginning of the Pasuk, sort of retroactive, and it goes back to the word V'yotzak. So the Gemara says, I'm going to prove to you that Rabbi Shimon does not hold that Mikra Nidrash Lefanov Liachorov. V'so Rabbi Shimon Mikra Nidrash Lefanov Liachorov. Atanya, we have a brisa, and this brisa focuses on the issue of Kabbalah Sadam, and the pasuk says, "V'atanya v'lokach hakohen midam achatos be'etzba'o v'nasan al karnos mizbach ha'olah." Now, the word etzba, as we learned already in Zvachim, always refers to the right hand. And the beginning of the pasuk, before the mention of the word be'etzba, says v'lokach. So now we're going to see the Shitas Chachamim that we read the pasuk be'etzba both lefanov and liachorov. So be'etzba v'lokach melamed shelo tehei kabbalah ela biyamin. That the Kohen who receives the dam, kabbalah sadam in a klisharis, he has to receive it while he's holding it in his right hand. And then we read it lefanov be'etzbo v'nosan. In other words, when he puts the dam onto the mizbeach, he has to do it with his right hand. So that is the shita of the Tanakama that reflects the principle of mikra midrash lefanov uleachorov. Amar Rabbi Shimon, v'chi nemar yad b'kabbalah. The yad here, meaning the pasuk of etzba, refers to the nesina, that he has to put the dam on the mizbeach using his right hand, but it doesn't refer to the kabbalah sadam in the word v'lokach. Is hol v'lo nemar yad b'kabbalah kibel b'smol kosher. V'yomer Abaye explains what's the root of this machlokas. B'mikra nidrash lefanov u'lachorov kamivli. Rabbi Shimon sovar lachorov nidrash lefanov eno nidrash. So it's dafka the chachamim who require Kabbalah b'yad yamin because the principle of Mikra Nidrash Leachorov, that's what you thought was Reb Shimon. No, Reb Shimon is the one who says no, that the Mikra is only Lefanov, requiring Yad Yamin for the Nesina Saddam, but there's no requirement of Yad Yamin with regard to Kabbalah because Velokach is before Etzba. So therefore, at this point, the Gemara has to offer a different explanation for why Rabbi Shimon holds that there's a requirement of Kohen with regard to Yitzika. Elahainu time of Rabbi Shimon. The pasuk says again. We'll go back to read the pasuk again. V'yatzakol shemen, etc., etc. V'hevi'ah el bnei Aaron hakohen v'komatz. V'hevi'ah, and the pasuk adds a vav to the word v'hevi'ah, and that allows Reb Shimon to apply a different principle of exegesis, namely vav mosif al inyan rishon. And that allows you to connect it with that which came before it. So that which came before it was the Yitzika pouring the shemen onto the kemach, onto the soles, and the requirement of etzba now applies even. The requirement of Bnei Aaron, applies even to Yitzika that came before it. Once again, the Gemara is going to analyze, is it really Reb Shimon who holds this principle of Vav Mosav Al Inyan Rishon? Elameyato, if that be the case, Tichsiv, the Pasuk says, now we're talking about Karbonos in general, it says, V'shachat es ben abakar, v'krivu b'nei Aaron HaKohen es adam, v'zorko es adam. So the word v'krivu opens with a Vav. And before that, it mentions Shchita. So if you can apply the principle of Vav Mosav Al Inyan Rishon, then the same requirement of V'krivu b'nei Aaron, namely Kohanim, that applies to all the avodah, the Zrikas Adam, should apply now retroactively to the beginning of the pasuk where it says V'shachat, which would mean, and this is an untenable position, that Shchita of Zevach requires a Kohen. That's not so. So Shchita is Ksheira Bizar. Mikabola v'elach mitzvahs kahuna, and therefore from Kabbalah, meaning after Shchita, the first avoda is Kabbalah, that requires mitzvahs kahuna. But Malamed ala Shchita sheksher bizar, ilu Reb Shimon vav mosvel inyan rishon is Shchita chinami bizar te psula, right? Because the vav is going to take me back to Shchita, and here the pasuk explicitly mentions Bnei Aaron HaKohanim, and the requirement of Bnei Aaron HaKohanim through Vav Mosvel and Yerisha is going to apply even to Shchita. And we know that that's not so. That's a different story. The Omar Krov v'Samach v'Shachat. So now we have a drasha that's going to teach me that you don't require kahuna in the case of Shchita. So even though, again, if we would normally apply the general rule that Reb Shimon accepts, and he applies it to Yitzika, namely that Vav Mosel Lishon Rishon, if we'd apply it here, we would come to the conclusion that the Shchita of a Zevach, it requires a Kohen and not a Zar. But now that we have a drasha comparing Shchita to Smicha, is Ma Smicha Bezarim, Af Shchita Bezarim. Now, who does the smicha? It's the owner of the bailam of the korban. And that's when he recites vidui and so forth. Now, the owner of the korban presumably is not a Kohen, because 99% of the population are not Kohen. And now, from this drasha, we derive the conclusion that Shchita doesn't require a Kohen, and even a non-Kohen could do the Shchita. Now, how far are we going to go with this equation between Shchita and Smicha? Are we going to apply the same rules? Because the rule of Smicha is that the owner, the bailam of the korban who brought his korban, he has to do the Smicha. So the Gemara immediately asks, Ma b'Smicha b'bailim is af Shchita b'bailim? We never found that the Shchita of a korban has to be implemented by the owner of the korban who brought the korban. And the Gemara says, Ahulo motzis amrit. We cannot apply the principle of equating Shchita to Smicha to such an extent that the Bailim of the korban would have to do Shchita, and that is because Shchita is one of the four avodos that culminates with Zrika. Kal v'chomer, Uma Zrika de Iker Kapara. Right, the most important highlight of all the avodos is definitely the zrika. That's what generates the kaparas hakarbon, and yet the Torah requires a Kohen, the Ika Kvila, and it's the Kohen who's on service in the Mikdash is going to implement the Zrika, but not the Bailim. So you see that even when you get to the apex of the Kapar of the Mechaper, you don't need the Bailim. Is Shchita, Delav, Ika, Kapar, Lokolshken, you don't require Bailim? So that even though we do have a hekesh between smicha and shchita, but we're not going to go as far as to say that just like smicha requires the bilim to do the smicha, so too shchita and carbon requires the bilim, because we have this equation to smicha. So that far we're not going to go. And the reason is because this kavachom from zrika. If zrika doesn't require bilim, then certainly shchita doesn't require bilim. And if you'll slug me up and you'll say, ain't done an efshar, misha efshar, right? The case of Zrika is a case of efshar. Shchita can be done feasibly by the owner of the carbon, but Zrika must be performed by the Kohen, and the owner of the carbon is presumably not a Kohen. So again, in Shchita you could have argued let the Bailim do the Shchita, but in Zrika you can't come up with such an argument. So your whole Kavachomer really is a fallacious Kavachomer. In other words, maybe Zrika per se would have required Bailim, except for the fact that it's an Avoda that requires Avodas Kohanim. So that's called Ein Donim Efshar Misha Efshar. The Gemara says, Goli Rachmana B'Yom Kippurim. I didn't skip anything, did I? One second. Right. That what? V'shocheres parachatos hashalo. He, the Kohen Gadol, has to bring his own personal chatos, his own animal, a par, and v'shochat. And the Torah says that he shechts it. And the Torah is giving us the exception to the rule, michlal, that the general rule would be the shchita bi'alma lo be'ino and bailim. From the fact that the Torah went out of its way to tell you that in the case of the par shel Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, he has to do the shchita, and it's got to be b'bailim. We derive that in general, shchita of any other zevach does not require the bailim. Omar Rav, kol mokum shenemar Torah v'chuka, eino elo li'akev. If we have both words in a parsha, in a mitzvah, and it says both Torah and chukah, it teaches me that this is essential. So the Gemara challenges this because Salkedait, at this point, the Gemara thinks that Tarti Boy, we need both Torah and Chukah. Kirichsiv, Zos Chukas HaTorah. Right, so in this pasuk, which opens up the Paraduma Parsha, we have both the words Chukah and Torah. And we think that both words have to be there in order to apply the principle of essential, that which is critical. Frek the Gemara, I'm going to show you a case where it doesn't say both Torah and Chukah, and yet it's likuva vari nazir deloksiva by Torah. It doesn't say Chukah with regard to nazir. So what that would mean is that according to Rav, certain dimensions of the carbon of a nazir are not essential because it doesn't say chukah. But Rav himself says tnufa bin nazir miakva. Right, the carbon of a nazir requires tnufa, and without that tnufa, the carbon is possible. And yet, right, which carbon are we talking about? We have ola, chatas, and shlomim. Ah, yeah. So they did the hakrav of the shlomim, and then afterwards they take the right foreleg of the shlomim and they wave it. That's called tenufa. The Brisker Rav has a whole discussion about whether this tenufa is a unique mitzvah in Shalmei Nazir, whatever. I remember that from my youth. But be that as it may, why should tenufa be ma'akiv according to Rav if Rav holds that unless it says both Torah and Chukah, it's not likuva? And yet in the parasha of Nazir, the Torah says Torah is also Torah said Nazir, but doesn't say Chukah. Shiny Hassam. Why is it that Tnufa is critical? Keva dichsiv, Kain Yaaseh, Keman dichsiva ba chupa dami. Kain Yaaseh means do it this way. And that's telling you that it's absolutely critical. So even though in general you need both Torah and Chukah, but here, in the case of Nazir, for Tnufa, it's enough that it says Torah. Why? Because it says Kain Yaaseh. Frekti Gemara Varei Toda the Loksiva Be Elatora again. It doesn't say Chukah, and yet keep in mind the carbon Toda was accompanied by four different categories of breads. Each category had 10 breads, all told 40 breads, and yet Arba Shebetoda Ma'akvim Zed Zed. We have a Mishnah that says explicitly that you have to have all four categories of lechem for the Lachmei Torah to be valid. So we see that even though it only has the word Torah, nevertheless, it's absolutely essential that he has all four categories of lechamim. Now, I'm not sure what that means. Does it mean he has to have all 40, or does it mean he has to have a representative of each one of the four categories? I'm not sure. Let's just see if he adds anything here. Fine, but the Bryces teach that all four types of bread are essential. Yeah, he doesn't answer my question. Okay, fine. So Gemara says Shiny Toda. Why is the Arba Toda Lachmi Toda four categories Ma'akev? Because the Chsiv, the Torah says Al Zevach Toda Shlomov. The Omar Mar Shlomov L'Rabos Shalmei Nazir. So what does it say? Shlomov, right? It's his shlomim, and that comes to be marbe, the shlomim of a nazir, in the dinim of Toda. The pasuk al zevach Toda shlomov. Let's see the whole pasuk. Al chalos lechem chametz yakriv karbano al zevach todas shlomov. Now, once again, how did we know that the law of Nazir is likuva? Because it says Kain Yasa. And now there's an equation between Nazir and Shalmei Toda to tell you that just like it's likuva in the case of Nazir, it's also likuva in the case of Shalmei Toda. Very mitzora. The loksiv beitodos nan arba minim shebimitzora ma'akvin ze et ze. Now, what are the four minim? Again, we'd have to open up a chumash to Vayikra Yudalid, but in the English version, which I don't like so much, it says that when the Mitzvah comes to purify himself, he has to bring two live birds. He's got to bring cedar wood. So that's number two. Number three, he has to bring a crimson thread. And number four, he has to bring a hyssop. So from the Brisa, we know that the absence of any one of these species invalidates the whole carbon, or I should say invalidates the whole Tara process, and they're essential. So you see that even though it says Torah and it does not say Chukah, yet in this it's essential. Shiny Hosam came to Ksiv Zos Tia Toras Hamitzorah. Like the word tia means tia always teaches me it has to be b'havayoso, the exact way that it has to be done. Kemad d'chsiv bechuka dami. For Yom Kippurim v'lo ksiv be'elachuka. Now we go the other way around, right? Until now we've been looking for mitzvos and karbanos where it says Torah, but it doesn't say chukah. Now we have a case where it says chukah. No. Yeah, where it says chukah and it doesn't say Torah. Usnan, Shnei Seirim Yom Kippur Makfim Zed Zeh. Right, you have to have both Seirim. One is the Sorah Pnimi, the other is the Sorah Chutz. And therefore, at this point, the Gemara gives up, and now we have to reinterpret Rav. Ella, O Torah, O Chukah. This is also going to be rejected. In other words, if it says either Torah or Chukah, that's enough to tell you that it's essential, and therefore in the parsha of Shnei Seirei Yom Kippurim, it says Chukah, and that's enough to tell you that's Likuva. He has to have both Seirim. Right, you're telling me that either Chukah or Torah tells me it's Ma'akev, but now I'm going to prove to you that in other Karbonos where it says Torah but doesn't say Chukah, are you going to tell me that it's not Ma'akev? He gives an example here. He says, Haktorah say Murim, and I don't know if he mentions Achilas Hashiraim. Anyway, there are many parts of the Korban that are not Ma'akiv, and yet it does say Torah. So apparently Torah alone is not enough. So the Gemara answers, Torah boy chupa, chukah lo boy Torah. In order to prove that something is critical, you need not only Torah, but you need chukah. Torah alone is not enough. You need Torah plus chukah. Torah v'chukah kamar. What are you going to do with Rav's language? He says that you're only likuva if it says Torah and chukah. Hachi kamar. Afal gav d'chsiv Torah, iksiva chukah in the ilo lo. So Torah alone is not enough, but it also has to say chukah. So here we have something from Rabbeinu Tam. Right now it comes out, according to the end zone of this Gemara, that chukah teaches you something is essential. Initially, the Gemara had thought that you need both Torah and chukah. And that's why, Rav requires both words. Then the Gemara says, or maybe either word. The Gemara now realizes that chukah doesn't really indicate that something is essential, even though, again, the Gemara says, Torah boy chukah, chukah lo boy Torah. But that's based, says Rabbeinu Tam, on Gzeir Shava in Maseches Zvachim Yud Zayin, between a non-Kohen who does the avoda. No, not a non-Kohen. A Kohen who's mechusa begadim, he's not wearing all the big dekuna, and a Kohen shasui who drank intoxicating beverages. So just like big day kahuna are essential, so too, if he's intoxicated, that's likuva. So Rav takes from that wherever the Torah says chukah, it's included in that same Gzeir Shava, because that Gzeir Shava between Mechusa Begodim and Shasui is based on the word chukah. So now anywhere where it says chukah, we apply the same rules, and that is likuva. You're telling me that once it says chukah, it's included in the gzeira shav, and therefore it's likuva. But Rab himself said that kol makom sheichzeh kosav b'toras mincha enu el liakev. Only when the Torah repeats itself, then it's ma'akev, hichzer in, lo hichzer lo. So even though there is chukah in mincha, yet it's not likuva. Right? For example, the achila shirayim. Shiny hosam tichi ksiva chukah achila ksiva. So in other words, the word chukah doesn't appear in the context of the avodah of the mincha, but rather in terms of the achila of the shirayim, and therefore it doesn't indicate essentiality. But in a general sense, chukah would indicate likuva. In fact, the Gemara of Harei lechem paponim. In the case of lechem paponim, which has what? 2 starim of 6 and 6 lechem. Then it has the shnei baziche levona, the chik siva chukah. Let's apply your principle that when it says chukah achila siva. Just 1 second. Achila siva. The pasuk says, "V'hoisali Aaron ulubanav v'chaluhu b'makom kadosh ki kadosh kadoshim hu lo mishi Hashem chak olam." And the pasuk is referring to v'chaluhu, that the Kohanim at the end of that next Shabbos will get to eat from the lechamim, and that's where the word chukah is. And Yerusnan shnei star ma'akvim zed shnei bezichim akvim zed star v'zichim akvim zed. So don't tell me that wherever it says chukah in the context of achila, then it's not likuva. Here we have something where the word chukah appears in the context of achila, vachluhu, and nevertheless there is a din of likuva. Ella kol heicha diksiva achila, akula milsa ksiva. We're in trouble now because now we're going to have to assume, based on the Parsha Lechem upon him, that whenever the Torah says chukah in the context of achila, then the word chukah goes on the entire process, not just on the achila. So therefore, if we come back to the mincha, carbon mincha, even though you told me that the reference of chukah is to achila, nevertheless it should apply to all aspects of the mincha. And Rav states, no, it's only when the Torah repeats itself, that's when it's essential. Shani Hasam, the Amar Kra. In other words, in the parsha of Mincha, the Torah says with regard to komets, migrasa mishalma, migirsa u mishalma. The extra hay at the end of each of the words. From finely ground flour and from oil, it could have said, but instead it says finely ground flour and its oil. Shamna. In other words, that's teaching me that you need the full measure of kemach and shemen, and that's essential to a mincha. So you see clearly that the word chukah just 1 second. So in other words, from this drasha of Migirso Mishamna, we learn the din of Likuva, but otherwise, Chuka itself would not teach me Liikuva.